Okay, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this stream after lunch. Seleena is a PhD researcher with the University of Southern Queensland. She was born in central west New South Wales. She has a background in ag science and a master's in peace and conflict resolution. She describes herself these days as a rural sociologist. So I would like to make way for her presentation, Social Identity in Two Rural Communities, a prison or a path.
I want to start with telling you a story. In the 1930s, John Gilruth was a talented government researcher who found that zebu, or Brahman crossed with British breeds, excelled in a number of ways. They gave tick resistance. They could thrive in dry seasons. They had a heat regulating capacity and an immunity to certain diseases. They could move more freely and walk faster to water. The zebu cross cows were more defensive of their calves against dingo attack, and the calves would go with their mothers to water, while the British breeds left their calves with one cow minding them, which made them more vulnerable to dingoes and other hazards. The zebu cross showed rapid growth and early maturity, and in short, they gave a better financial return per head. The Premier of the day was convinced by the scientific results, and the meatworks also supported an immediate interbreeding program. But the industry representative organisations bitterly opposed it. Those with status as British breed studs had a great deal invested in opposing any changes to the breeds, the traditional breeds. They fought for the continued supremacy of their familiar breeds. They tried to shut down the research, claiming it contaminated, and they were opposed to the use of research stations for furthering the research, actively opposing any industry funding for that research. Gilruth and his protege, Ralph Kelly, spent a lot of effort travelling around to rural areas, engaging with the people on the ground, the primary producers, explaining the results of their research, showing them the facts and the benefits that this new breed could bring. But they were heckled in those meetings. The pastoralists called it the mongrelization of their British breeds. They said it would damage the entire structure of beef cattle breeding and do great damage to the cattle industry. They banned them from entering the Royal Exhibition and put them into the rodeo yards, and then the horse stalls, and then the dairy section. Country Life refused to take ads for Brahmins. Dalgetty's staff were threatened with the sack if they even spoke to zebu breeders. And then, eventually, after some years, the Queensland Minister for Ag and Stock suggested that the zebu cross should all be rounded up and shot. They had the lead researcher removed from the work, and he subsequently went overseas to pursue his career. As one producer explained, and I quote, "The feeling was if you had these humped animals, you were socially inferior. It was said that if you were a breeder of these, nobody in the club would speak to you." Unquote. So the opposition to accepting the Brahman breed was not based on the science of productivity or practice. It was based on the social cultures, norms and narratives that comprise the social identity of the prominent pastoralists and industry leaders, and that framed their bitter opposition to the results because it presented a material and symbolic threat to their social standing, to their story of who they were and what the real world was. They moved hard and fast to eliminate that threat to their identity and successfully obstructed the introduction of Brahman crossbreeds for decades. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about research conducted into social identity dynamics in two small anonymous Queensland rural communities that I've been working on. I'll outline some of the social phenomena, and I'll tell you how it results in resistance to change, resistance to new ideas, and how it suppresses fresh input and social diversity. The two anonymous research communities are in southeast Queensland and have town populations under 2,000. They both have an economically diverse and strong base. In 2019, they received newcomers for reasons relating to employment, lifestyle, family connections, property affordability. I conducted 89 interviews across the demographic and analysed and coded their interviews. While the communities do have some differences, The influence of an established dominant social set was, as a common influence, was evident in both. This research uses the lens of social psychology to explain how social group membership influences human choices and actions. Social identity is how we present ourselves in different social settings. It's very fluid. Context matters a lot. A person will present differently at the sale yards to how they present when they're in church. We can be members of many different and unique social groups, but some of them matter a lot more to us than others. And to belong, to be trusted, one must exhibit, or at least not challenge, that group's unique social norms and their story of who they are and how they do things. For social groups that matter to us, we modify aspects of ourselves to accommodate or acknowledge the pertinent group norms to fit in. We adjust the way we dress, speak, our values, views, behaviours to project a self that will fit in with the social practices and expectations of the relevant social group to show respect. The benefits of doing so include positive esteem, social certainty. We then get reciprocal insider knowledge and privilege, some contextual status and power, or maybe it's just a way of staying socially safe in an uncertain environment. In small communities, there are not too many social groups that we can join. So those ones we are a member of probably are pretty important to us. The cost to accommodating the group norms is that our inclusion is dependent on compliance with those identity norms and narratives. If you're a marginal member and only give token compliance or only accommodate some of the social positions and practices to get along, to have good manners, to be respectful, or to stay socially safe, then you will pay the price of being a little bit on the outside, not quite trusting. Individuals may explicitly challenge the status quo when they seek to correct or improve or contribute to some aspect of the group practice. This might be done in good faith, or it may not. But that identity challenge, symbolic or material, is generally not welcomed unless the challenger is recognised as one of us, a dominant and legitimate member of the in-group. In the research communities, negative competitive conflict arose when established in-group representatives felt challenged by an outsider or a marginalised individual or an out-group that had illegitimate status. Who do they think they are? This motivated antisocial action on a sliding scale that went from having a quiet word of advice through to threats of violence. Social aggression presented as pejorative labels, stereotype criticism, blame or shame gossip, withheld support from those trying to get things off the ground, or actual targeted hostility against individuals to create obstructions, difficulties, penalties, a bad name. It intended to exclude them, diminish, dismiss, and punishment, and ultimately to suppress any difference in the worldview or practices of how we do things around here, directly or indirectly. It also applied not just to the individuals, but to their ideas, initiatives, businesses, to new policies, laws, proposals, to change in general. Unless a new idea or a new proposal demonstrated some alignment with the interests, the social benefit or values of the dominant social set, it was very hard to have that change adopted. Many creative, overt or subtle mechanisms could subvert that proposed change. It might be carried by the enthusiasm of newcomers or outsiders for a while, but they could be worn down and burned out by the ongoing inertia of withheld support, derisive talk, mockery, contrasting the change with the local narrative of what's real, what's practical, the way things are done, what's truth around here. In this way, the socially dominant could undermine and diminish the validity and value of training, experiments, new learning about new approaches or proposals because they were resisting a material or symbolic threat to the familiar norms and narratives that sustained their understanding of their unique and exceptional and morally superior, often, identity. Newcomers were often spoken of as not legitimate, new businesses not local, youth or the marginal were declared not interested, some leaders were not us, and proposals were dismissed as impractical here. Newcomers who became leaders because, for example, a vacancy could not be filled, often experienced high levels of passive social resistance, personal attack, eventual burnout. Newcomer businesses ran into problems with community reputation, online criticism, malicious reporting for breach of this law or tax law. They withered for lack of local custom. And business owners found themselves subjected to gossip about their personal life, their morality, the state of their shop, the nature of their business. It all rested on lack of recognition as true residents or community members. Oh, they're not local, you know. Social sanction and censure was used to target non-compliance. They were policed for challenge, policed for breach of social norms and boundaries. As one person said, they're the big boys of town. You don't want to be offside with them. People feared challenging that dominant socio-cultural norm unless they had established social support that helped them weather that social scorn. This was a mechanism that the old guard used for retaining the familiar and defending against change. In a small community, conflict cannot be compartmentalized to just one part of your life, so it's highly aversive. It motivated factions because people sought to shore up their social safety with numbers. They and others avoided community conflict by stopping from participating in community events. It was a prevalent reason for people to withdraw from participation in community groups or attend activities or community events because they wanted to avoid the antagonists or avoid association or recruitment to one side or the other. In summary, identity parameters can be a social prison that constrains the unique expression of experience, ideas, skills, personal qualities, because people don't want to be different. They want to avoid social sanctions. There's a low tolerance of difference, of questions or challenge or changes, even if that might serve the interests of the community. If it doesn't serve the interests of the socially dominant, it's going to be unpleasant. So that outlines the prism of identity. What about the pathways of what is possible? Well, firstly, neither of these communities had strong identifiable communal leadership like a local mayor. But there are individuals within both of the research communities that do make a significant difference to the socio-cultural experience of newcomers, and I call them bridges. They are progressive and actively help new people to find connections, solve local problems, or solve their problems locally, contribute to community well-being. They work the social landscape to achieve outcomes. One of the research communities had a lot more of these than the other, and that community had a higher measure of social capital. The bridges were often marginal members of the dominant social set, so they were socially well established locally. They were accessible for a chat. They took active interest in newcomers and what was going on in the community, and they had personal respect, networks of support, and they could work either discreetly under the radar or in public projects. They might have been outsiders, wives of or returned adult children of dominant established families, or members of the dominant social group who found themselves for some reason offside, marginalised. They could also be newcomers who had somehow established personal standing and wide networks of sufficient social support that allowed them to persist in the face of severe opposition and eventually recruit support. When successful, the public initiatives that these guys got going were celebrated and owned by the wider community as communal achievements. The natural tendency of social groups is towards exclusion, to protect the boundaries and privileges of being but one of the in-group, to protect the in-group identity. Effective influence to create a meta-identity narrative of accepted diversity in the community, to change group values towards inclusion and openness to new ideas, did in this research rely on an influential minority facilitating welcome and integration of newcomers. The elite tend to defend and enforce the community's social qualities that sustain their own dominance. And where those factors are threatened or eroded, intolerance becomes entrenched. This erodes community cohesion, suppresses diversity, and access to available social resources, and it shrinks the capacity to embrace possibilities, to be resilient in the face of change. This social identity research gives a deeper insight, I hope, into the motivations behind that resistance. It also speaks to the social influences on adopting new ideas and practices. It's a relevant insight for those who want to build the capacity to embrace change and build positive socio-cultural qualities in community or maybe industry. So I began telling you the story of beef industry innovation, the introduction of Brahman cross genes that have since contributed enormously to the North Queensland cattle industry's strength, but which were viciously resisted by the social elite of rural Queensland for 30 years. The new was mocked and derided, but Brahman genes did become part of the industry because outsiders kept adopting, adapting, learning, persisting, resisting against the critical social elite. They built their own social resilience to the attacks, pushed back, took action as a new social group, got visible with a new breed, kept recruiting with results until they changed the social norms and narrative of the industry. Interestingly, once those norms changed, some of the established social elite claimed that the crossbreeding innovation had been their initiative all along, was certainly not the result of any government-funded research. But the important point here is that this was never a battle over science. It was a battle of the social sets, with the old guard protecting the familiar norms and narrative of a world in which they were well placed and heavily invested, while the upstart newcomers persisted and forged a path into the future.